One more thing to go, and it's not thing one, it's thing two. And thing two, as we all know, is the best of the two. So we've come to the end of the rainbow. As we all know, at the end of the rainbow is a pot of gold, and that's what we have for you to close this out, okay? Andy McAfee is my partner in crime at the MIT IDE. He is about technology, including the second machine age, machine platform crowd, more from less, and his most recent book, Geek.AI. He's not going to be talking about those books exactly, but I'm sure he'll weave in some of the ideas. Today he's going to be talking to us about generative AI and the competitiveness chasm. And before I give him a roaring round of applause to bring him on stage, I just want to have one round of applause that just crescendos into Andy for the staff of the MIT IDE, including David Verrill, Albert, Aaron, Carrie, Aileen, and everyone else. You guys are amazing. Look at this fantastic conference that you put together. Everyone here experienced top rate. I mean, it was amazing. Can we all please give them a round of applause? Thanks again to Thinkers 50. Thanks again to Accenture, our partners in this event and in many other things. Thanks again to Wiley, and with no further ado, Andy McAfee.
Sinan, thank you. I think of all the introductions I've ever received, that was the most recent. It was also one of the best. That's extraordinarily kind. Thank you very much. I want to talk about not what generative AI is going to change about this task or this job or this element of the workforce. I want to talk about the implication that it's likely to have on competition throughout the economy, not just in the high-tech sector. And I have a relatively confident prediction about that, which I need to explain a tiny bit. I think that AI and this latest chapter, generative AI, are going to widen a competitive chasm that already exists. I need to unpack that. I need to explain that a little bit. And I want to start by drawing a picture or a visualization of what competition has looked like among America's most valuable companies over about 100 years, over the course of the 20th century, and then we'll take it into the 21st century. Now, you can't capture everything that's important about a nation's worth of competition on one visualization, but that's not going to stop me from trying. So on the horizontal axis here, do we have slides, or is that just me? Okay, on the horizontal axis, we're going to go decade by decade. And there's going to be a column of bubbles representing the 50 most valuable U.S. companies by market cap at the start of that decade. The area of that bubble is going to be proportional to the percentage of total market cap that company has. If that sounds a little abstract, let's make it concrete. Here are a bunch of bubbles, 1930 through 1990. And when I look at that, I don't see a ton of turbulence or a ton of disruption going on. I see a relatively stable group of great big companies kind of remaining where they are in the competitive landscape. And to me, one of the striking things about those companies is how old they are. I've got those thin horizontal lines drawn. I think you can see them at 1900, and again at 1945 for the post-war era. And that orange line is the weighted average age across the top 50 most valuable companies in the country. And you'll notice right up through 1990, that average stays below 1900. And we can label some of these big, giant bubbles that we've all heard of. Companies like GM and GE and AT&T and IBM appears as this newcomer in about 1960, 1970. These companies are not fresh-faced kids. These are just gigantic, fairly old legacy incumbents. And they're still duking it out decade by decade, but you don't see a ton of turbulence. And then we get to 1990, and it kind of, bless you, it kind of looks like the situation's going to change. There's this sparkling of young companies up top for the first time in 1990. And what's really going on there is that the Justice Department broke up AT&T earlier that decade and led to a bit of entrepreneurship and spinning out from the telco industry. So up there at the top there are young companies. How many people here are willing to admit that they are old enough to remember NYNEX? Remember, they had the New York, New England Exchange. That was one of the most valuable companies in the country in 1990. You see one green bubble up there at the top. The bubble indicates classic high tech. There's one green bubble. That indicates, remember digital equipment? That was in that brief shining moment in the 90s when we thought that New England, the Northeast, was going to be the center of the American high-tech industry. I don't want to give too much away. It didn't play out that way. So we're going to keep drawing this picture and fleshing it out with more recent decades. But before we do that, I want to highlight visually and quantitatively another important trend that unfolded not in the 20th century, but in the 21st century. We've got really good data going back to about 2007 about what American companies were spending their investment money on year after year. You know, you got bank vaults and pizza trucks and pizza ovens and trucks, all these things that companies spend money on to go to market and take care of their customers. What do those trends look like? And in particular, the data from the government allow us to break those trends out into two categories. We can break them out into digital stuff, just hardware and software investment, versus all the other equipment that we spend money in to make the American economy up. So I'm going to show you the digital and non-digital trends. The non-digital one is fairly interesting. In recent years, in real terms, there's a slow, slight decline going on in total investment in physical stuff all throughout the American economy. I think that's pretty wild. You might notice a differing trend for the digital stuff. Do you notice those two are not exactly the same? Our thirst for digital stuff, hardware and software, really does appear to be insatiable at this point. We don't see that leveling off. And keep in mind, this green line ends before the generative AI revolution really picked up steam. So those lines cross somewhere around 2017. Does anyone here think they're going to recross? Please, find me at the reception. Let's make a bet. I want to take your money. That's the easiest money I'll ever make. This is kind of a big change in the economy. US companies are now spending about 1.8 times as much year after year on digital stuff as they are on all the physical gear put together. My guess is if we go grab the latest data, I wouldn't be surprised if it were 2 for 1 by now. And so this, to me, brings up the question, great, let's keep drawing that graph and watch what's been happening. Keep our eyes on those classic 20th century giants that were founded in the 19th century. Let's keep drawing that graph and see how they've been doing. And in particular, can we look at this digital transformation that's been unfolding and how it affected the top 50 most valuable companies in America? So remember, that's the graph where we left it. And again, you might notice a bit of a break in the trend because this is what's been happening recently. You look at those bubbles that were prominent in the 20th century, that were founded in the 19th century, and with remarkably few exceptions, they have really not showed up to the current party. The current party is being thrown and hosted, and the people having a really good time in it are these big greeny bubbles that we see up top. These are very young companies, and they are by far the most valuable public companies in the country in recent years. So if we layer the names on, it's going to surprise absolutely nobody. These are the companies that we hear about and read about and are, I think, correctly obsessed about all the time. So this is a fairly big break. I think it's remarkable that we've got a century of relative stability across the top 20. And then as we entered this era of digital transformation, wow, did that get shaken up. And the action appears to be among these very young companies that we put in the high-tech industry. I don't love that label. And they've got the big green bubbles these days. And so that brings up the fairly fundamental question. Okay, why is this happening? What's going on here? And there are two things going on. One of them is glaringly obvious, which is when there's that big gold rush going on, selling picks and shovels and blue jeans to the miners can be a very, very good business to be in. So if you are selling that gear that we have a bottomless appetite for, this can be a really good business. This is NVIDIA. This is Microsoft. These are gigantic, big green bubbles these days. I don't think we need to spend a lot more time on that phenomenon. The one that I think is more interesting, and I hope a little bit less obvious, is that industries that are really far away conceptually, via their product lines, far away from classic high tech, we see a lot of the incumbents in these industries getting disrupted by tech-savvy founders and the companies that they start. My shorthand for those people and their companies is just geek. My last book was called The Geek Way, and I think it's the appropriate label because these people are just classic computer geeks, and they went out and founded companies that are doing interesting things really all throughout the economy. I want to make that concrete by giving you a couple examples. Stupid question. This might be easier to do in the negative, right? Is anybody willing to admit not being a Netflix customer? Good Lord, there are like, what, 3 total in this room. Netflix is ubiquitous. How many of us remember subscribing to Netflix when it was a DVD by mail? Okay, a few more brave hands go up. This was literally the founding idea of the company. The co-founders of the company realized that you could fit a DVD into a standard first-class American envelope and mail it without any additional postage. And they said, Eureka, we're going to take on Blockbuster. That's our gigantic ambition. And they did. They mailed DVDs around the country a lot. We all know they didn't stop there. And by about a decade later, they realized the next step in entertainment, as bandwidth increased, was you're going to be streaming entertainment to your home. And this was kind of wild-eyed, frothy mouth talk for a while, but it became clear that was going to happen. Hollywood, which has been a very stable place, populated by the same large players and studios and entertainment producers for about a century at that point. Hollywood looked at all this, and they were collectively not worried. This is one of the 2 favorite quotes that I found that I put in The Geek Way. They interviewed the CEO of Time Warner, legendary American studio. They interviewed the CEO of Time Warner in 2010 about Netflix. And he said, I've looked this up like 3 or 4 times. This is actually what he said. It's a little bit like, is the Albanian army going to take over the world? I don't think so. At the risk of getting ahead of myself, the Albanian army has taken over the world in Hollywood. So a lot of us know the history from there. By 2013, Netflix debuted House of Cards. That was the first Netflix original. And they have not looked back, and they have become, I think, arguably the world's biggest and best producer of filmed entertainment. They're responsible for some silly share of global internet video traffic. They either tie or they're number 1 or 2 in all the Emmy nominations and wins every year. And just for fun, earlier today, I looked up the market value of a couple different companies that we've heard from. Netflix right now is around $360 billion of market capitalization. You want to check back in on Time Warner? So they've been through a few different gyrations. They've been spun out and wound up and spun up. And now they're called Warner Brothers Discovery. It includes CNN, Discovery, HBO, all the time, all of that. Collectively, all of that is worth about $24 billion. On the order of 1/15 as much as Netflix. Disney, this is the iconic American global entertainment company. They're doing okay. They're worth about $200 billion. But that's, Netflix is on the order of almost twice as much value created there. The Albanian army took over the world in less than 15 years and a historically very stable, tough industry to break into. That is not the only example of this phenomenon. Anyone here not obsessed with Elon Musk? My hand is down, right? And it's easy to overlook some of his accomplishments, given the furor these days. It's easy to overlook some things that his companies have actually done. SpaceX was founded in 2002 because Musk thought that we needed to become an interplanetary species. That was really the founding vision of the company. A little bit different than DVDs getting mailed around the country. And then he said, okay, to do that, I think we're going to need rockets. Literally, have we read this in the biographies of Musk, like Isaacson's biography? His first idea was to go buy rockets from the Russians. He hopped on a plane and negotiated with the Russians for old USSR rockets and thought that wasn't going to work. And then he and his colleagues said, I guess we got to learn to build rockets. And then they did. And then 14 years later, 14 years from their founding, they demonstrated the first commercially viable, reusable orbital rocket. The rest of the space industry, collectively to that point, had had 0 of those launches. Now, SpaceX has done more than 400. They've had more than almost 350 reflights by now. The rest of the space industry combined, as to this point, has done 0 commercial reflights. This starts to look like unfair competition. A couple of years ago, SpaceX was responsible for 60% of all the weight and 80% of all the satellites that left Earth's surface. They've become a de facto monopoly on getting payloads into space in 20 years. And they were just getting started. Because as they were building these rockets, it's an expensive undertaking, and they were not making a ton of money and relying on big sporadic government contracts, Musk said, we have to find a different way to make money. You know what people will pay for? Bandwidth. And you know what satellites can do? Deliver bandwidth. This was not news to anybody in the space industry. We launched Telstar, the first communications satellite, in 1965. So the space industry that was more than half a century old at that point. SpaceX comes in, and they dominate it from a complete standing start. By now, Starlink has 4 million customers. They're in 100 countries around the world. And again, this astonishes me. When Russia invaded Ukraine 2 years ago, there was exactly one organization on the face of the planet that could deliver thousands of rugged, portable, high-bandwidth satellite internet, hard-to-jam terminals into a war zone. It kind of makes me wonder what everybody else in the industry was doing or thinking instead of being able to deploy that capability. I think this is just an astonishing comparison. SpaceX, as we all know, still wasn't done. As of right now, they are the only U.S. organization certified by NASA to take astronauts into space. I thought I was going to have to update this earlier this year because Boeing put a couple astronauts on their spacecraft, got it up to the International Space Station. I'm redoing my slides thinking, up until 2024. And then NASA said, hey, Boeing, we do not trust you to bring human beings back home from space in that same vessel. No, we're going to send a SpaceX spacecraft up to bring those astronauts home. Remains unclear if Boeing ever will get that certification from NASA, but SpaceX already has it and has done on the order of 14 or 15 missions so far. This is a deeply, deeply uneven comparison by a bunch of geeks over the space of about 2 decades. I hope my broader point is becoming clear. I don't think we've seen the end of these stories. I could tell an equally lopsided story about competition in the worldwide auto industry. The defense industry is becoming a very, very interesting place right now as the geeks start to apply their energy there. And so I think we're going to see more of these very lopsided competitions going forward. And it brings up a question that I got so interested in, I wrote an entire book about it. What are they doing? How are the geeks able to do this stuff? What makes them so disruptive? That's obviously a career's worth or decades worth of research to understand that deeply. Let me give you a quick and dirty explanation that I don't think is completely off base. Think about the high-tech environment that today's geeks grew up in, the classic high-tech industries. Moore's Law is the central fact in the background of those industries all the time. This tick, 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 things just keep getting better. I don't know if the doubling period is 24 or 12 or whatever. Things get twice as good with remarkable predictability and remarkable speed. That means you've got to build fairly complex stuff that it's going to have a very short life. You have to keep innovating or your customers will abandon you quickly. Because markets are big and we saw what that green line looks like, there's pretty intense competition here. And once in a while, the high-tech industries are going to throw a weird curveball at you. Exhibit A here is generative AI. This is a very tough industry to do business in. In particular, it's got this combination of very, very fast change and extremely high uncertainty. This is where the geeks grew up. This is what they learned to do. If you learn to get good at that, you have to acquire a set of capabilities to survive and thrive in that environment. You better be able to innovate. No one's going to let you off the hook for quality and reliability. You have to execute. When these curveballs come along, you have to pivot. You need to do it in this very challenging environment. And you can't do it just once. You have to do it consistently. You better make money at some point, and your scale is going to get alarmingly big, and you'd better be able to continue to perform at that global scale. Successful geeks have kind of had to do that. And what I think is going on is they're looking around the rest of the economy and saying, where can I put this set of skills to use? And I think the answer is kind of everywhere. I want to see this energy coming to more and more places. I want to try to draw one last visualization of what's been happening with the competition between these 20th century incumbents and the geeks over the course of the 20th century. Have the dominant companies of the 20th century, have they demonstrated much of an ability to create value, especially when we compare their abilities to the abilities of the geeks? Let me try to draw one final data visualization to get at my answer to that question. Okay, so this one, this is really ambitious. I'm going to try to combine space, time, and value creation on one slide for a quarter of a century on one slide. Are we ready? Okay, on the horizontal axis here is the founding year of the company. You're going to see bubbles here again. You're going to see 50 bubbles, but these are not the 50 most valuable companies at one point in time. What they are instead are the 50 companies that have created the most value so far over the course of the 21st century. We stopped this analysis at the end of 2023. So market cap appreciation between 2000 and 2023. 50 biggest examples. So we're going to plot them. And you'll see green bubbles and blue bubbles like we are used to. And we're going to plot them in 2D space. On the x-axis is the founding year of the company. So younger companies are going to be way over there. And on the y-axis, this is where it's going to get funky, right? The y-axis is the longitudinal distance, the east-west distance, not the total distance, the longitudinal distance from Palo Alto, California. Palo Alto is the legendary home of the U.S. high-tech industry. It's where, I forget if it was Hewlett or Packard's garage, but it's where the garage was, where Hewlett-Packard was founded out of. So we're going to do the horizontal distance from the Hewlett-Packard garage and see what that tells us. America is a pretty big country. It's, call it 3,000 miles end to end. So the visualization doesn't work well when the y-axis is linear. So if you look very carefully, this is a logarithmic scale for the y-axis. So it's going to go 5 miles from Palo Alto, 50 miles from Palo Alto, 500, 5,000. Does that make sense? Are you tired of hearing somebody talk about a graph and you want to see the graph at some point? Okay, I want to do a quick show of hands, though. Where do you think the big cluster of value creation is going to be? Just use your arms and kind of point to where you think the action is going to be. So I said there's a little bit of a rightward drift here. Okay, how about the horizontal? How about the vertical axis? Okay, so we're inventing new, very bad dance moves right now. And we're doing kind of a this and then kind of a this. Yeah, you're exactly right. Here's what's been going on. So these are the 50 biggest value creators among American public companies over the course of the 20th century. And you notice kind of a cluster and a stream, right? The cluster are the group of companies that are all down and to the right. That means they are very, very close, east-west, to Palo Alto. Very close. The top one there is about 15 miles east-west away from Palo Alto. This is right in the neighborhood. And they're very young. The youngest companies, most of the companies inside that cluster were founded after 1975. So I think about that cluster down there as kind of a box where it's 15 by 75. 15 east-west miles by 1975 or later. And that's where a lot of the value creation has been. Green, again, are classic high-tech companies. You look up top, and there's kind of the rest of the economy. And it doesn't really matter if they're 1,000 miles or 2,000 miles or 3,000 miles. They're up there, and they've created value. Yeah, great. Compared to those big green bubbles down at the bottom, they're getting their clocks cleaned over and over again. Might be an inelegant way to summarize it. That cluster down there at the lower right, where you were all correctly pointing, that cluster contains about 60% of the total growth in value and market cap across America's 50 biggest companies, 2000 to 2023. So I look at that and I start to say, what's going to happen here? So I'm going to draw not a box. I'm going to draw this is my visualization of the competitive chasm that I was talking about. There seems to be a whole lot of pretty impressive value creation happening down there to the right, and a whole lot less of it going on all throughout the rest of the economy, all throughout a gigantic age range, and all throughout a huge portion of the country's overall geography. And the question that I'm keeping my eye on going forward is this going to change? Or when we come back together, I don't know, 5 years, 10 years hence, what's that going to look like? My prediction is that AI, this chapter that we're living through, and generative AI, they're going to widen that chasm. And when we come back, unless the incumbents start doing things very, very, very differently, I think we're going to see more of the total value down there in that lower right-hand cluster, in that 50-75 box. Because, to refresh our memories, here are the characteristics of a digitally intense industry. Let's say that's a fair list. My question then is, are AI and generative AI, are they going to make those things more salient or less salient? Are they going to calm the world down or make the world faster and less uncertain? Who's on team calm it down? Yeah, who's with me? It's going to make things faster and more uncertain. Okay, great. I didn't hear too many nays on this one. Given that, unless those blue bubbles that are floating out there in the rest of the visualization, unless they learn to change some of their really fundamental approaches and practices and philosophies about competition, I see that competitive chasm getting wider instead of deeper. I want to end with a quote, my other favorite quote when I was researching the Geek Way. I interviewed Steve Jurvetson, who's this legendary venture capitalist out west, very early investor in both SpaceX and Tesla. And he gave me this quote that if it were any shorter, I would have tattooed on myself because I like it so much. He said, when I was interviewing him, he said, look, Andy, the agile way that we have had to learn to build software in the industries that we compete in, the agile way that we've learned to build software, that's the agile way that we do everything. And he said, I sometimes think I have a sixth sense. I can see dead companies. They don't know it yet, but they're dead because they can't pivot, execute, innovate at anything like this, the clock speeds required to compete in this industry. He said the companies that I'm investing in, in the ecosystem, they're going to run circles around them in the years ahead. I'm kind of with Jurvetson. I would love actually to be wrong about this competition. I would love this issue. I would love to see more real competition between the geeks and the incumbents out there. So far, I don't think we're seeing very much. So my parting question, and I think you know my personal answer to it already, is what's going to happen 5, 10 years from now on both sides of this chasm? That sounds like a good question to ponder over a glass of wine or a cocktail at the reception. Thank you all very much.